Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. My name is Eirik, and today we are going to talk about reiterating on a design maquette, so that we can hopefully learn from our first attempt and come up with some better solutions. So what is really the point of this? You've already made a maquette. I think I've said before that I often use the maquette as a simple starting point. It helps me discover what I don't like, and then I can adjust that when I make a larger version. I don't need another maquette to help me figure out exactly what the changes I'm after are going to look like. But the problem with that is, of course, that your planned changes doesn't always pan out the way you want them to. I work from life always, or at least as much as I can when making larger pieces, and some of the answers I'm looking for, the model will provide me. But I really want to slowly head in a direction where I'm working from inspiration first and applying nature to that. As my friend Eirik Arnesen said so beautifully to me a few days ago, and I stole it right here. Sorry, Eirik. I think it's potentially a bit sloppy to not plan properly. No one would make a house without a good plan, a good drawing. In certain cases, I think it's fine. It depends a lot on the complexity of what you're trying to make, of course. A larger-than-life, two-figure composition is the most complex thing I've ever attempted to make, and so spending a few extra months planning seems to be worth it. Hopefully. I've also recently done a lot of research on Michelangelo in particular, but also other old master sculptors, and it always strikes me how much they prepared for their major pieces. So I think it's a step in the right direction of becoming a true professional at your craft, to be well prepared before you begin. Now that I've justified what I'm doing properly to myself, and hopefully to you as well, we can begin talking about the changes I'm planning to make here from the first version. Some of it you've already seen me do here on screen, and it's to do with the centerline and the tilt of the pelvis. For some god-awful reason, I tilted the shoulders and the pelvis in the same direction in the first version, which is a big mistake, a big boo-boo, and something I of course should have thought about. So this time I made adjustments. I changed the direction of the tilt of the pelvis as it seemed like the least invasive option that would improve things without completely scrapping what I'd created in the first version. So how did I reach this conclusion? Well, the aforementioned least invasive approach was part of it, but I needed to justify it, make sure it would work before I did it in the maquette. Because if it fails spectacularly in the second maquette, I'd have to make a third maquette. Sculpture takes time, so an easy way to figure out if your changes is going to be successful or not is to draw. So I drew up some rough examples using my previous design maquette as a reference and changed the tilt of the pelvis. Researching art also helped me reach the conclusion that this would be a good idea. Michelangelo did a lot of drawing for the frescoes he did in the Sistine Chapel, and most of these, or at least many of these, are plastered all over the interweb, so you can find them easily, along with the frescoes themselves, of course. There's so much inspiration to find here, it's mind-boggling. Michelangelo was a master at making seated figures seem dynamic, so I learned plenty by studying these, and found several clever solutions used by the masters which could be tweaked and applied to my design. The difficult part of all of this was that there was so much I liked with the first maquette. So now I needed to change the things I didn't like without overly affecting the things that I did like. And this was a bit tricky. The human body is so connected that as one part moves, it affects a whole host of others. And this part is the one that's not really easy to conjure up from your imagination. So once a lot of what I wanted to change had been planned, I got a model to do the pose for me so I could test if my plan was even somewhat feasible. And for the most part it was. I think the only difficulty I'm going to have is that the length of the torso that I want is hardly easy to find. It's hard to find a model that looks like that. The proportions I'd like Kronos to have are not your everyday man's proportions. But I do have a plan for this that I will explore further in a third maquette actually, so stay tuned for that. We'll explore how to tweak a model's proportions while retaining a convincing nature to the sculpture. It might not be possible and it might work really well, I don't know, but we'll make a try at it and explore and see what we find in a future video. Back to the changes. Tilting the pelvis in the other direction presents a bit of a problem. What happens to the pose of the legs? Which is not that big of a problem after all, because the legs were one of those things that I did not feel convinced by in the first maquette anyways. It's always good when your design changes ends up forcing change somewhere you'd want it to change anyways. My major gripe for the first maquette was the front view. I like it from several of the side views and 3/4 views, but the front view was particularly weak. And that's a big problem in a sculpture where there is no doubt that the front view is of major importance, if not the most important view. The front view needs to be this piece's major strength. I want this to be the first angle that people see. I want it to be the viewpoint from where people approach the sculpture. You should not be allowed to sneak up on a sculpture like this. You'll have to confront it head on in all its horror. So with that in mind, the changed pelvis tilt strengthens the front view. Now onto the legs. I made the first maquette before the summer was over, and right after having gone and seen the Bandini Pietà, also known as the Deposition by Michelangelo in Museo dell'Opera del Duomo here in Florence, Sandeep and I made a vlog about it, and you should definitely have a look at that. There's a link in the description below. And it was a profound experience. I loved it. But Jesus in this sculpture is dead. And I think I took too much inspiration in the way his legs are posed in my first maquette. Kronos is not dead. I wanted to depict him a millisecond from action, so the legs needed to reflect that. And the limp legs of Jesus in the Deposition doesn't really do that. So how do you depict legs that could spring into action at a moment's notice? Well, again, I had a ton of reference from looking at the Sistine Chapel. It's a Michelangelo specialty to create legs about to take action, even though they're seated. And even though it's a draped figure, the Moses is perhaps the prime example of how to achieve such a look. The thing I really wanted to hold onto from the first version was how Kronos' left leg pulls forward while the right leg pulls backwards. This stands in contrast to how his left shoulder is pulled back and the right shoulder is pulled extremely far forward. This contrasts very nicely and creates a dynamic effect. Try walking around and you'll notice a similar thing. As your left leg comes forward, your left arm goes back. They alternate. Try walking with the same arm and leg heading forward at the same time. It's very hard and very unnatural. Let's thank today's sponsors, my Patreon supporters on Patreon, who have ensured the continued existence of this channel and allowed me to upgrade my gear bit by bit, making better looking and better sounding content for all of you to watch. If you're interested in supporting the channel or perhaps interested in getting personal feedback on your sculptures from me, then Patreon is the place for you. You'll get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. And again, thank you so much to those of you who have given generously and supported me. It really means the world. We're skipping over a lot of the process here, and perhaps I'll make a proper video series on this maquette in the future. If you're interested, let me know in the comments below. I'll certainly make a how to sculpt miniature portraits video based on the head and face of this small sculpture later this year. So stay tuned for that if you're into sculpting very small heads. My Kronos kind of sits on the equivalent of a stool with a leg rest in an absurd way. I think it'll help you understand if you see it this way, so bear with me here while I explain. A child might slide off their stool, or perhaps a very lethargic adult might slide off their stool as well. But most of us will kick off the leg rest on the stool. A straight leg has nowhere to go. You can't really generate much power with a straight leg from a standstill position in the same way you can from a bent leg. So bending the leg back sharply creates potential energy, potential for action. Try this for yourself. Stand in a contrapposto, which is one leg relaxed and one leg straight, bearing most of your body's weight. The most effective and aggressive way to begin moving from this stance is to apply weight to the bent leg and straighten it, creating forward momentum. The other way is to allow yourself to fall forward from your straight stand leg, but this is not nearly as fast, not nearly as aggressive. The first version had the legs compress very unnaturally, I thought. They were too close together. And I liked aspect of this. I liked the knees aiming a little awkwardly inwards. It's always been a look that I favor for the sake of gesture. I just like the way that looks and the way that feels more than your classical gesture drawing with the long C-curve shape to the legs. So I wanted to retain that. When posing my model, I found that this was fairly natural anyways. If you want to go forward, this makes more sense than aiming your knee outwards. I played sports for many years, so I tend to look at things in that light, at least whenever it makes sense. And I think it adds something to the design. In those cases, I can justify it easily, at least. It's good to know how the body moves and how to move your body most effectively when posing. So the question then becomes, can I retain the knees aiming slightly inwards while getting rid of some of the awkward, over-compressed look? And what will happen if I do? I found my answers at the Met in New York while looking at the Ugolino by Carpo together with Mitch and Neve. There's a vlog about that as well that you could and should check out, by the way. I'll leave a link to that as well in the description below. The answer that I was seeking came from conversations about the Ugolino while we were there. Mitch mentioned how Carpo is not afraid of making decisions that make the mold incredibly difficult to make. And I know the Met has a marble version, but the original was sculpted in clay and cast, and the marble is simply a copy of that original. Ugolino's legs are not pressed together. There's a space between them and behind them. Pressing them together more would make for a much easier mold making experience, and a much easier marble carving experience too, I imagine. But by not pressing the legs together completely, you also create a dark shadow between them, which further serves to increase the overall contrast contained within your piece. I had a big piece of plumber's piping, forcing me to push the base closer to the back of the legs than I would have preferred it in my small maquette, but in the large version, I'll be able to avoid this, and there'll be an opportunity to create a really high contrast area, leading to hopefully a more dramatic piece. The other change I wanted to make departs heavily from the Goya masterpiece that I was initially inspired by, and that is the female character being eaten. The figure should be a child, according to the myth, the Greek myth about Kronos, but I'm much more interested in sculpting adults, and it's a lot easier to find adult models, so I chose to sculpt an adult female. Goya's child appears to be an adult female as well, even though it's quite ambiguous as she, or he perhaps, is only seen from the back. And to add to that, Goya never titled the piece himself. So perhaps it has nothing or little to do with the Greek myth after all, we'll never know. Goya's character is limp, very clearly dead. And I did this in my first attempt, but I found a few things that bothered me with this design in sculptural form. I'm going to call the eaten figure in my version the female for simplicity's sake from now on. The female ends up obscuring a large part of Kronos if she's hanging there limp, which I didn't really like that much. I vastly prefer a more open composition that display more of the anatomy of both Kronos and the female. I'm a huge fan of anatomy and the human form, not only from a visual standpoint, but I love the challenge of depicting it as well. So I wanted a solution that would let me do more of that. Part of the idea behind the two-figure composition that's over life size was to challenge myself. So another idea from Michelangelo entered the fray. Now I don't know if he did this for certain, but I have heard people with more knowledge than me refer to this, and it seems plausible to me that he did this. And that is something the fancy folks call dynamic figure fusion, which essentially means taking a figure and putting top and bottom together from two different views and connecting them between the pelvis and the ribcage in a hopefully convincing fashion. We can rotate our ribcage in relationship to the pelvis, but not as much as you would think, and it's an incredibly difficult pose to hold. It entered my mind that if the female figure appears to be struggling, fighting, I'll get to attempt a dynamic figure fusion. I'll get to display more of her anatomy in action and more of the anatomy of Kronos. Several side effects came from this that were desirable. Another note from Carpo's Ugolino, a 5-figure composition, and such a densely populated composition could easily become very confusing to look at, but Carpo solves this by including plenty of cleverly designed negative shapes, opening between the figures where air is flowing through. I had little to none of that in my first design. In this second design there is plenty, and from many different views as well. I'm much more pleased with this approach. Negative spaces give the composition and the viewer room to breathe. It feels less claustrophobic and more open. Separating Kronos and the female allows them not to be confused for each other. They stand on their own in a much more compelling way, I think. To finish this video off, let's touch on what I discovered in version 2 that I think needs to improve, and a few things that I've discovered that I like since looking at the finished piece a little bit. My number one thing that I dislike about this second version is how the right hand of Kronos interacts with the shoulder of the female. The scale here is of course a bit of a hurdle. I could have spent more time sculpting miniature hands, but frankly this maquette took far too long to begin with. It really didn't need to be as rendered as it ended up being, so I didn't want to spend any more time making perfect miniature hands. What I think will improve the connection is pulling the female's shoulder back a bit more and having Kronos' hand reach over her shoulder and pulling her trapezius muscle backwards. This, I think, will reinforce the feeling of struggle and allows Kronos to have a more convincing grip on her. I also think slightly more of a twist in the female would be desirable. Not for any other reason than I think it might look slightly more interesting and present even more of a challenge. And of course, more of a twist potentially means a more dynamic piece. A thing I really love about the second design actually is how much more complex it is than the first one. The overall composition of the first one is a very simple C-shaped curve. Perhaps an S or a slight S if you're including the bottom of the base and feel very generous. But the second version is so much more complex. The internal curve is much more of an S-shaped curve, and the outside borders resemble a diamond shape, which is considered a very balanced yet dynamic composition. A pyramid being a lot more stable, but not very active compared to the diamond. Internally, there are several smaller shapes like the triangle made by the right arm of Kronos, the left arm of the female, and Kronos' head. And these triangles repeat themselves down the figure in different orientations. The eye travels really well within the composition as well, I believe, and there's no point where the eye is led off into space, essentially meaning there's not a part that does not lead the eye onto a new part of the sculpture. I think my two major points of study this summer, Michelangelo's Bandini Pietà and Carpo's Ugolino, both have the same going for them. The eye of the beholder is kept on the composition, creating a sense of not being able to pull your eyes away from the piece, which is of course what you want. I think you have to be extremely self-critical as a figurative artist attempting to create something seemingly, or hopefully, more real than real. But for once, I'm feeling quite confident in what I was able to achieve in this composition here. I think it's a clear improvement on the first design. I solved almost all of the issues I had with the first one, and in doing so, I was able to include several other ideas and concepts that I've observed over the summer and that I wanted to include and put to good use in this sculpture. So let this be a lesson in preparation. Preparation does pay off. The next video in this series will be sculpting a third scale maquette from life to further refine the design and to figure out what problems arise when changing a model's proportion only in height and not in width, and what solutions need to be implemented in order for it to work successfully. If you enjoyed the video and want to learn sculpture, check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we can talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. And awfully soon, by November 7th actually, there will be exclusive sculpting content on my Patreon page. The first series we are embarking on is the Beginner's Guide to Sculpting the Figure. I'm super excited to finally be creating exclusive content for Patreon, and I hope you'll be too, and we'll take a look. The link to my Patreon page is in the description below. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, click the like button and share with your friends and family. It helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.